Thanks so much, Liam, as well as the speakers. All of you were great. It's not surprising, but it's always great to actually hear and have these conversations, especially against the background of COP. So for the next session, actually, we'll delve into one of the themes which kept coming up, and Dr. Kristian Nielsen will kick us off on impact-focused environmental psychology. And Kristian is a postdoctoral research associate at the Cambridge Social Decision-Making Lab at the Department of Psychology. He received his PhD from the Copenhagen Business School and has written a lot on actually this question of like different behaviors and the impacts of different behaviors and what really we should be focusing on. So I'm just going to hand over to you, Kristian, so you just jump in and take it away. And a big thanks again to the panelists before.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll try to just try to share my screen, sorry. Sure. Do you see my screen all right now? Lovely. Yeah, so as Gang said, I'll try to make the case for a more impact-focused environmental psychology. So what I'll be presenting—
Wait, you're, I think, on presenter view. So you might want to swap your—
Right. How do I do that? I don't have any notes, but it might look strange.
If you open your slides, there's a little like circular arrow thing right on top, which says gift something in potentially Dutch.
It says what?
So if you go back to your presentation view,
right,
and then you've got, if you go right to the top left-hand corner of your screen for me, you should find, there you go, near where your cursor is, the next one next to it, I think. Yeah, that should, oh, yeah, that's right, perfect.
Okay, perfect. It might be because I have my other screen. Sorry about that. Yeah, so as I said, I'll be trying to make the case for a more impact-focused environmental psychology. Basically, what I'll present today is derived from a very short letter that we published earlier this year in the Journal of Environmental Psychology. And I should acknowledge my co-authors because this is a very collaborative, but also very short letter that have, I think, raised some discussion, at least in the small field of environmental psychology. And basically in that short letter, we make two different points. I'll try to emphasize the one that hasn't been discussed that much since its publication. So just before I dive into the short letter and talking about impact-focused environmental psychology, I just want to specify who it is I'm actually talking to in this presentation. So I want to make clear that the audience of our small letter is basically psychologists, behavioral scientists who are interested in mitigating environmental problems. So this sort of has an applied focus in the research. So even if you study environmentally psychological phenomena and are not necessarily interested in mitigating different problems, this is not our audience. So it's very mitigation focused who we are talking to. So bear that in mind if you feel that I've offended you or something. I hope I don't. But so I just want to highlight a few ambitions with this very short talk, but it's basically, I want to propose a new alternative impact-focused research agenda for basically how we can study the mitigation of the environmental problems. And then I just want to prompt sort of a checkup to see, are we all agreed in sort of where our research is focused at the moment, and do we have the eye on the prize? For some people, the prize might be different, so we can discuss that. What is our prize? But I just want to prompt that sort of self-reflection. And finally, I just want to stimulate more coordinated and systematic environmental psychological research. And I think already what we're doing today is sort of going along down that road. So I hope I can amplify that even more. So the premise of our letter, and I guess also my talk, is that mitigating existential environmental problems to a large extent hinges on changing human behavior. I think most of us will probably buy into that premise, but I think it's important to spell out. And another possibly controversial point that we make is that psychologists so far hasn't really have too much impact on global scientific initiatives or collaborations to mitigate climate change or biodiversity loss. So in the IPCC, we have some psychologists involved, and I think Lorraine is one of them. And we've seen that more psychologists are now involved in the IPCC than was the case for the last assessment round. But in the IPBES, the counterpart, I guess, for biodiversity, we see very few psychologists involved. And that could be a reflection of our research, or that they haven't discovered the value of our research. I'll leave that up to you to decide. And the final premise is basically that psychology should play a larger role in these collaboration. But in order to justify us having this greater role, it must be sort of justified by the quality of our evidence, and obviously also the relevance for solving the problems that these global scientific initiatives care about. So just a few reflections that sort of stimulated our short letter, and also, I guess, the motivation for presenting an alternative research agenda is basically, in environmental psychology, there's a strong emphasis on psychological theory rather than the impact of the behaviors that we study when we set different research priorities. So the typical approach is we have a theoretical model or construct we want to test, and then afterwards we select the behaviors to study. Another reflection is the widespread use of pro-environmental behavior as a concept. So I really don't like that concept. There might be some value because you have the same concept that works across different domains, but it sort of speaks more to a person's motivation rather than the impact of the behavior. So again, it's sort of a legitimized or a catch-all concept. So you can study anything that has some sort of environmental impact, but you don't think about the variability and the impact of that behavior. And finally, I think it assumes generality, so that we see some commonality in the different types of pro-environmental behavior. And finally, and most importantly, I think what motivated our letter was basically that in the environmental psychology literature, or even in the behavioral literature on environmental problems, there is a tendency to focus on behaviors that have very low environmental impact. So this could be recycling, shutting off lights, bringing a canvas bag or whatever to the supermarket rather than buying a plastic bag. And these are not the behaviors that are important for mitigating climate change and also biodiversity loss. And in the literature, there's quite a strong neglect of very high impact behaviors, but especially those that are infrequent. So this could be air travel. We see some more research on that. But for example, we see very little psychological research on home purchases, vehicle purchases, other investment decisions, and so on, that over time has quite a high environmental impact. So this is the tendency that we observe that sort of inspired this letter. So as an alternative, what we propose is basically a 5-stage inductive research agenda. So basically turning the research agenda on its head. So rather than coming from a theoretical concept or theoretical model, when we select research, or when we decide on research priorities, we start at the behavior and then build from there. So the 5 different stages is basically impact, behavior mapping, accumulate behavior-specific knowledge, and then subsequently extend to other behaviors, and finally synthesize and theorize. And I'll just go through each one fairly quickly. So impact. So the first stage is basically selecting behaviors to study before you start thinking about theory. And what we propose is that you identify behavior with a high potential for affecting or impacting an environmental problem, a very specific one. So this could be biodiversity loss, but also within a specific context. So what is it could be a regional context that you're interested in. So is the behavior, does that represent an environmental problem or contribute to an environmental problem within the specific context that you care about? And when we talk about behavior, that's not only as us people in our role as consumers. So there's a tendency to mostly among psychologists to focus on our consumer behaviors. Some of them are definitely important, but there are many other behaviors through which we can influence climate change mitigation and also mitigation of biodiversity problems. For example, our role as citizens, so obviously activism, quite a lot still research on that, but also investment decisions, what we do in our organizations that we're part of, how we act as members of communities, and sometimes even how we act as role models, if we are a role model for other people. And I think at this stage it's critical to highlight the need to sort of look at evidence on environmental impact assessment. So this means also consulting evidence and research outside the psychological domain. So what you can look at LCA, so life cycle assessment studies, other types of environmental impact studies, to sort of see what is actually the impact of the behavior. So once you select your behavior, you then study basically the behavior in quite a descriptive manner. So you identify where and in which context the behavior occurs, how often, and who are the actors that perform them, and are the sort of specific characteristics that characterize these actors. So basically at this stage, we don't necessarily need very elaborate or novel psychological theory. Here it's really more about understanding the behavior and the context around its performance. So it's quite ironic, but if we would teach somebody how to change behavior, we'd always say you need to understand the behavior first before you try to think about how to change it. But yet there's a tendency, I would argue at least, in the literature, we skip this step. So we just jump straight to the theory and just select the behavior. And this is also, I guess, to some extent reflected in what type of papers we publish. So you rarely see descriptive papers being published, especially in the I guess, higher ranked journals. And the same with observational research. This is, in my view, very undervalued and a critical step for building high impact and effective interventions later on. So once you studied the behavior and thought about the behavior within the given context, you start accumulating more behavior specific knowledge. So this is, you can look at what are the key determinants of the selective behavior, again, in the context, in the study context. Later on, you can start thinking about what possible interventions could be used to then target these key determinants and obviously evaluate their effectiveness in changing the behavior. And here, ideally, we would measure actual or even self-reported behavior if measuring actual behavior is infeasible, and not proxies like attitudes or intentions, which I guess I can understand the tendency to measure these, but we know that the link between intentions and actual behavior are sometimes modest at best. So again, if feasible, try to measure actual, even self-reported behavior. And just, yeah, on that point, also measuring actual behavior, it's also, and in a very quantitative fashion, allows you again to think about what is the environmental impact of doing that, and depending on frequency of behavior, performance, etc. So once you've done this very elaborate step within a given context, you would then try to expand to other contexts to see is there commonality in the predictors, for example, of the behavior. If you perform the behavior, say you did the initial study in the UK, does that then generalize to another context, say in Germany or in Thailand or in Mozambique or wherever? Then over time, you will build evidence that relates to that behavior across different contexts. And then once you've sort of done that, you try to repeat the stages 1 to 3 for different behaviors. So again, going through the quite meticulous steps to understand the behavior, high impactful behavior across different contexts. And ideally, you coordinate these efforts with other research groups and maybe even pool resources to get high-powered studies, especially at the intervention stage. And finally, and I think very critically, we should synthesize the evidence. So we have a desperate need, I think, in environmental psychology to figure out ways to better integrate different results across different contexts, across different behaviors. So this could be systematic reviews, which to some extent is used. We use meta-analysis, but I think we can go further than that. And ideally, we would have some sort of open source database where we can submit evidence in an open source way so everybody can assess it, like they have in health psychology, like the Human Behavior Change Project, where you can actually search through different types of behavior change interventions and the different mechanisms, and then you can see what is the current evidence. Something like that, I think, for environmental psychology would be a critical step moving forward. Then once you've built up this very contextualized and behavior-specific evidence, we can start and think about theorizing. So we can start to see, are there sort of general principles that cut across different contexts, across different predictors, across different behaviors, to then try to integrate that with other influences on behavior and environmental impacts. And then ideally, we could get a more integrative theories for example, there was a paper in Nature Human Behavior suggesting that the replicability crisis in psychology is not a reflection of the lack of theory, but rather too many micro theories. So ideally, we could get some sort of higher order integrated theories, or we could figure out from this evidence that we've now generated that we can have very contextualized theories. So we can come up with theories that only apply to, let's say, very wealthy regions or for wealthy segments, or whereas you can have something that mostly applies for other types of segments. So those are sort of the 5 steps pretty quickly. Then I just thought, okay, I might add my hopes for, I guess, the future of our field. So obviously what I'd like to see, and I think my co-authors would like to see as well, is a greater focus on high impact behaviors. And I think this would be critical to sort of justify us having this greater influence on interdisciplinary climate-related projects, but also for policymakers. And I think a critical step in getting to this is to basically make descriptive and observational research much more sexy, also for journals, but also for viewers that should be more accepting of it. You can run an excellent study with high quality data that's just descriptive. That doesn't mean it's not a good study just because you don't embed theory. And the same with observational research. You can have like a diary study or an experience sampling that you run for 2 weeks where you get within person information much closer to the situations that allow us to start thinking more, I guess, systematically about potential determinants and how that might vary over time within and across different social and physical environments. And finally, or not finally, so one thing I'd like to see people justify in their paper, sort of piggybacking off, I guess, recommendations from the open science community, is basically that we should justify the selection of the behaviors we study. And we should sort of state what is the environmental impact of those studied behavior within the study context. So it's not a problem to study low impactful behaviors like recycling. For example, plastic waste is a huge problem in typically developing countries. And even if it's not, just specifying what is the environmental impact of studied behavior, I think increases the transparency of that study. So I'd like to see that or submit that as a recommendation, I guess. And one problem that we argue for the more deductive research approach is basically that it bakes in the assumption of generalizability across contexts. And I think the more inductive approach sort of gets rid of that, because we know from all behavioral science that there are very few psychological universals in the world. And we should acknowledge that, I think, in our theories, but also in how we communicate our evidence. And I think having contextual evidence is still relevant for policymakers and theory development. And you could even argue that contextual evidence is even more relevant for policymaking than having something from a completely different context. And then, as I said, I'd love to see more and better coordination and synthesis between different research groups and synthesis of, I guess, of research evidence. And finally, more communication with other disciplines. And I'm not necessarily only talking about different behavioral science disciplines or even social science discipline, but also talking to natural scientists or physical scientists. And I think there is an underappreciated potential for psychologists to get involved with people who do integrated assessment models, for example, because they bake in assumptions about behavior that just not always transparent about it. So having stronger conversations with these research communities is also a way for psychologists to increase their impact. And then I just want to close by saying that there has been some, I guess, subsequent discussion within the journal of our letter. So there was a reply to our initial letter that Lorraine, I'm pointing at you, was part of, and we then wrote a response to that. So if you're interested, please also have a look out for these two. And I just want to end on a quote by the great Elinor Ostrom, that basically a resource arrangement that works in practice can work in theory. And that was what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Kristian. So I have a quick question about the question of impact. And then I'll open it up. So people who have questions, just put your hands up, put it in the chat, and I'll try to point to you. So when we're thinking about high impact, it's very difficult to define impact. Typically, we rely on things like carbon emissions. I think a life cycle analysis is a bit more holistic. I wanted to raise the question of impact on who. You can have impacts on people, and it could be abstract impacts like carbon emissions, which could be more global, but you could also have very specific impacts linked to, say, deforestation in a particular country in the global south. These sorts of conversations have become really popular in co-op. Do you think there's scope to look at that in your research, or basically your thoughts there? And also everyone put your hands up for questions.
So did you say impact on people?
Impact on who, I guess. So impact on what and impact on who. So you can have impacts on water, land use. You could be distributed across the global north and south. And how do you weight those different impacts in the choice of your studies, basically?
Right. I think that the way I see it, that's part of the justification for the environmental impact. So I say environmental impact, but obviously there are many, many different types of environmental impacts. So it could be you care about protecting a species from extinction. So you talk about what is then the key, I guess, environmental impacts that sort of threaten that species. And that's totally fine, as long as you don't say that it's also, whatever behavior change is also critical for mitigating climate change. And I think where we came from is that many environmental psychology papers start off by saying the importance of mitigating climate change, and then they end up studying something that is not necessarily very important for that. So I think just being transparent is about what sort of environmental problem are you trying to solve, if that's your objective, I guess. And then it's also totally fine to say that we care most about the social impacts of this behavior. Just specify that, but then just don't necessarily place it in a context of, say, mitigation if it's not sort of justified, I'd say, if that makes sense.
So I guess the call is to be transparent in your research agenda, apart from thinking very carefully, what does impact really mean? Maybe.
And that's where I think that's why I raised the concept of pro-environmental behavior, because that's a catch-all. So you can say, this is pro-environmental behavior, and then you look for commonalities in theories or whatever, without sort of specifying, I guess, the diversity, heterogeneity within that concept. And you could say the same with pro-social.
Yeah.
What is that?
Yeah, so I think I really like the idea of having impact up front and then really thinking about carefully what does that mean in a specific context into a population is really key. So thank you, Kate, and everyone put your questions in the chat as well, and I'm happy to.
Oh, thank you, Kristian, for a fantastic presentation. I'm very convinced by the agenda. I guess it's more comments that I'd add and would love to hear your thoughts on it. So to build on Ganga's impact on who, also impact in what time frame. So, you know, how long does some of these behavioral interventions continue to act on people for, as well as spillovers, which I know Ganga's talked about in our research, Lorraine's talked in our research, the indirect impacts that we have through focusing on a specific behavior. They're all things that I think are really crucial to that agenda. And I'm just wondering, have you thought about where they fit? Is it to do with behavioral mapping, that we try to understand the interdependencies between these behaviors in the first instance? Do they come in at the intervention stage? Do they come in at every stage? Just love to know your thoughts on it.
We'll see if I can capture all of that. So I guess the time frame, I think, is critical. So, for example, one of my collaborators, Kimberly Nicholas, she got somewhat famous, I guess, in this community for saying that we should have fewer children, or that was one of the most high impact behaviors you could do. But obviously, if you consider not only looking at how do you allocate emissions, all of that, but if you think about the time frame of those emissions, so if you don't fly tomorrow, that's emissions saved. Whereas you sort of getting a child, that takes a long time before that accumulates the same amount of, I guess, greenhouse gas emissions. So thinking about that, you can even go to the level of specifying between different sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So methane stays in the atmosphere for 100 years or something, whereas CO2 is much longer, and so on and so on. So I think just, you might not necessarily go to that level within just a behavioral science paper, but thinking about it, I think it's critical. And I guess even also the persistence of behavior changes, which is difficult when you assess behavior change evaluations, right? Because of, I guess, resource constraints on our part typically. But you measure something, it might be on an online experiment, you can say, I can manipulate behavior, but then maybe an hour later, the behavior change might not sort of stick around. So yeah, again, the time frame, I think it's critical, both at the intervention level and at the environmental impact.
Perfect. Leo.
Thanks for this brilliant talks. Really interesting. So a question mainly on the institutional side of it. So some people would say that behavioral science is essentially a Trojan horse for psychologists to get some influence in policy making. But I think in economics, really, the main influence maybe came from Council of Economic Advisors that sit in the government. We do not have a Council of Psychological Advisors. There's a paper of that title by Kees Sunstein 10 years ago or so. And I'm wondering whether that is the right place to engage in this type of research rather than academic psychologists. So I'd like to know which avenue you see that we should get the psychological insights into policymaking. Is it, it seems a step is missing in the agenda that you propose.
Yeah, I guess in terms of influencing policymakers, right. I think you're right. So we need, that's one way to get at it. So for example, the COVID response, behavioral scientists were quickly on and sort of submitting their recommendations for how to change behavior. There was a paper in Nature Human Behavior, I think Sandra was on that also elicited a response, so is psychological evidence really at a state where we can sort of say in the situation of crisis that we have enough evidence to suggest this without considering the specific context. So I think it depends on our evidence. So is it really strong enough to make clear policy recommendations? You could argue that changing one behavior might not be a matter of life or
He will come back to us. I have faith. He's back. There you go.
Sorry. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. Sorry about that. So yeah, there are many steps. So I think that this so it was a page and a half, right? This paper. So we could probably write a book on it if we wanted to really elaborate. So then I think there are many steps missing. And how do we get to policymakers? So on the one hand, you want to argue our evidence is relevant if we think that's the case, but still sort of having the humility to say, when is it not necessarily strong enough for us to make a clear prediction about anything? But it could also be to test or propose to policymakers, hey, try to implement this whatever psychological concept, because it might be relevant, at least at a trial and error kind of stage before you roll it out. So I think their psychologists can contribute different ideas that are not necessarily coming out from economics or something.
Any other questions? We've got a point in the chat, which I think Heidi made, which is interesting. Heidi, do you want to just articulate your question? And that could be maybe the last one.
I don't remember having a question, Gaga. Which one is it?
Tipping points.
Oh, well, you know what? That's just, so my background is in oceanography. So I really look at it from the physical side in a lot of ways. And we have such a critical time window. And we were just in the chat talking about methane, and, depending on how you run the numbers, 64 to 85 times the climate forcing of CO2. So if we're looking at that time window, how close we're getting. Once you get to, the Greenland ice sheet is gone. Once you get to the methane hydrates buried in the ocean are now released. Once you get to the permafrost has melted, that's all, it's done. It just takes off. So I was just making that point that there's so many different things to look at in terms of time frame and impact.
Yeah, I think, and to that point, I think that's partly the reason why this is quite an important agenda, right? Because we really have to start thinking in terms of impacts, and impacts of what and when and on whom, because I think if we don't do that, we're wasting valuable efforts. So Kristian, I'll give you the last word and then we'll jump to the next one.
I don't think I have much. I think I agree with Heidi's point. I think, yeah, we obviously in a new situation for everybody, where we sort of have to speed up things so quickly that we all a bit sort of stressed about it and trying to figure out a way to sort of get it done. And I would say that getting to the wealthy and most powerful people on the planet, I think that's one way to do it.
So, yeah, and I think who is the source of emissions is key, right? Because we've got reports now which show that it's highly concentrated in a few sectors and amongst a particular class of income and wealth. So that could be perhaps an important place to target interventions. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kristian. We go to the next one. Who is up? Are you here? Goethe should team